Okay, welcome to lesson 6 here, which focuses on chapter 5, socialization. So, um, I just want to sort of demystify this notion of socialization. It's an extremely important topic in sociology, and you can kind of think of this most simply as learning your culture. In other words, socialization is the process in which you learn those beliefs and values and norms of your culture. So that's why you see the picture here is of a classroom. So socialization, part of our socialization actually does occur in a classroom, but not all of it. Much of it occurs, of course, wherever you learn things. And you can probably imagine the most important agent of socialization is the family. Right, so that's where young children learn most of what they learn about their culture, their society. Daycare is another one, the neighborhood, the one that always makes parents sort of screech in horror is that they also learn from peers. Your peer groups, your friends are another agent of socialization. In the workplace, we're of course continually socialized. So this happens throughout our lifetime that we learn our culture. So I kind of wanted to just show you here a few things related to socialization. Now, one of the big debates in the social sciences that's been going on literally for thousands of years now, and it certainly has picked up in the last, since the beginning of sociology and psychology, is how much of who we are is because we're born with it. That's the whole nature side of things, right up here, nature. And how much of who we are and who we become is because we learn it, or the nurture side of things. So I can tell you that you might be able to guess that sociologists are really on one side of this equation. And hopefully you're thinking, well, sociologists, they talk about society, they talk about groups. So we're on that nurture side more or less. I mean, we really focus on how we learn the things we learn, not so much on what we're born with. So sociologists, it's not that they don't view nature as important. They just think that most of what we get or what we know is because we learn it. So it's not built into us in any sort of shape or form. I'll give you a classic example: racism, treating people bad because they belong to a different group. We know from our scientific studies that that's not a part of nature. If you put babies together who are of different races or ethnicities, they don't treat each other any different. In fact, they don't really see each other as any different. They're just babies to each other, just small children. It's clear that something like racism evolves out of how we're raised, how we're taught. So we're taught those sort of things. So that's where we really focus on. Now, one of the areas that we see as very important is how does nature and nurture work together? In other words, what do we get from nature and what do we get from nurture? And so we've had these cases where sociologists can't really study this directly because it would be immoral. And so think about it. If you wanted to know what came from nature and what came from nurture, what would you do? And one thing you could do, if there was no ethics involved, you could take a child, separate them from love, separate them from their parents, separate them from affection, and see what happens to them. Because whatever happens to them has to be a result of nature, that is, of biology, because they won't have that socialization. They won't have that interaction. Now, as I said, we can't do those studies because it'd be unethical. However, you've probably heard of stories like this from the news in which these cases have occurred, or at least have kind of occurred. Some of these classic cases are cases of very severe abuse where a child is locked up in a room, locked up in a closet or in a basement or something, and ignored and not seen. Your book starts with the case of Danielle. So definitely read into that because you'll see with Danielle, who was eventually rescued from this very neglected home environment, abusive, neglected home environment, that Danielle was placed into a very loving family, but where she has a lot of good socialization now, and they're teaching her things. But Danielle was never able to really pick up on the rules of society or even pick up language. So in some ways, her biology sort of cut off the ability to learn language. And we know that this is true from other research, that it is much, much easier for people to learn languages at a young age. So this has always been one of my big irritations with our public education system, because when do they teach foreign language? Oftentimes still in high school. And all the research says if you want someone to learn another language, you should teach them that language as soon as you possibly can. So pre-K would be great, or kindergarten would be good, and people would learn that language a lot easier. So we start to see some of the elements here related to nature and nurture. Now, we've also seen some studies that really show what happens to children who are in these types of environments. One classic sociological study is a study done by Skeels and Dye. In the Skeels and Dye study, they took kids who were living in an orphanage back in the old days, in the early 1900s. And of course, orphanages were not a very great place to grow up in. They didn't have enough people working there. There wasn't enough attention for children. And that's really why we don't do orphanages near as much as we used to. That's why we developed a foster care system. Well, Skeels and Dye took infants at an orphanage, and they split them up into two groups. One group stayed at the orphanage. The other group they put with women who were living in what we would call a state hospital, or a place for people with disabilities, severe disabilities, mental handicaps, these sort of things. And what they found out was that the children who they put with these mentally handicapped women grew up perfectly normal. And it was really because of the love and affection that they got from their surrogate mothers. The children who grew up in the orphanage, who had little contact with other people, did not do near as well. We also have seen some studies on animals that show how this whole nature and nurture work together. So the key here, though, when you're thinking about socialization is how do we learn? How do we become? How do we learn our culture? How do we become who we are? Now, I want to actually talk about a symbolic interactionist, a guy named Cooley. And Cooley talks about how we become who we are. And he talks about socialization into the self. That is, sort of getting our own identity. That's what he's talking about with this self, right? The image of who you are. How do we develop our own identity? And this is where we really get the sociology of things. Cooley said that this is really a process. It's kind of like a circle, in that we imagine how we appear to other people. So when we do something, so take someone, I'll give you a solid example here. Take someone who is a comedian like Chris Rock. Right? As a child, Chris Rock would do something. He would tell a joke. He would have a little thing that he did, some little whatever Chris Rock was doing. And then people would react to that, right? People would react to him telling a joke. And the reaction would probably be that they'd laugh. And so what happens is our identity, our sense of self, forms based upon others' reactions to us. So kind of get that clear. I mean, you can see what he's saying here. In other words, we become who we are because we interact with other people. So what's important for our identity is those interactions with other people. So it's not all going on inside our head like psychology. It's really our interactions. So when someone laughs at Chris Rock's jokes when he's a kid, part of his sense of self, part of his identity becomes that of a funny person. He starts to see himself as funny or comedic or a comedian, something along those lines. And so over time, we develop our self-concept based upon how others react to us. Right? So that's Cooley in The Looking Glass Self. So I just wanted to give you a little short introduction here into socialization, so you could kind of start to see how people are socialized. Right? How people are socialized. So you can probably imagine that there's a lot of socialization going on at home. What people worry about, of course, is, are people socialized from the media, from television, from video games, right? The worries you'll see people say, if someone plays a lot of violent video games, are they more likely to go out and commit a crime? And what they're really asking is, are people learning expectations of behavior, being socialized from those video games? And that's a great sort of question, and it's a topic of research. The research doesn't show any strong indications that that's actually true, but people are certainly worried, and of course I know many parents are worried that their kids are being socialized from television, whether it's MTV or Housewives of Atlanta or whatever the case that may be. They're not learning the things they should be learning. So but be sure to review this chapter, so chapter 5, socialization, in the book. And once again, have a great week. Keep up the good work.